So just want to kick off before I start talking about anything. Just want to kick off with a little exercise to get a feel for the room and the level of knowledge that we have in the room. So I'd like everybody to stand if you have worked or if you are working with a Scrum team. Okay, thank you. That's probably about 99% of people in the room. That's good. So if you've been working with a Scrum team for over a year, can you remain standing, please? Okay, and if you could remain standing if you've been working with a Scrum team for over 5 years. Okay, slightly less people. Now I'd like people to stand if you have seen burnout happen in your Scrum teams. And now I'd like you to stand if you have felt yourself burning out through the Agile process. Okay, and finally, I'd like you to remain standing or stand if you're a little bit sick of me asking you to stand. Okay, yep. Thank you for your honesty there, appreciate that. Okay, so what I'm trying to get across there was on a very minor scale what Scrum fatigue may actually feel like. You do get asked different questions every single sprint, but you're basically going through the same motions to get to the answers. And that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. I'm going to be talking about my experiences with teams that I've worked with and what I've seen. I'm a Scrum Master and an Agile coach. I suppose I'll pop that up to start talking about myself. I have been a Scrum Master for close to a decade and an Agile coach, kind of the same thing in my mind for the same period of time. I started working in an Agile way about 9 years ago. It was 9 or 10 years ago. I was a front-end developer working in a few different web agencies, and our project management style was pretty ad hoc, if you can even call it ad hoc. It was a bit of a shambles. And I fell in love with Agile 9 or 10 years ago. So Agile is very dear to me, and the Scrum process is something that's very dear to me as well. I do work for a company called Boost in Wellington. We are a software development company, and as a company, we fell in love with Agile 9 or 10 years ago, and since then, we've also become an Agile consultancy. This is a picture of me in the middle of loving Scrum. I do absolutely love Scrum. It's something I'm passionate about. In some ways, it makes me feel quite old-fashioned to say that, because Scrum is I think it's very close to being 21 years old at the moment. So that's been around for a long, long time. So long that it's had a chance to get antiquated, and so long that it's had a chance to really just become a little bit run-of-the-mill for teams, and certainly for a lot of people to get tired of using the Scrum process. In New Zealand, however, I feel we're still relatively new to the Scrum process. The title of this talk is Battling Scrum Fatigue. That's not a slight on Scrum, because like I said, I'm pretty passionate about it. It was originally mislabeled in the program as Beating Scrum Fatigue, which I asked them to rename, because I don't think it can be beaten. I don't think you can get to the point where you've decided, yes, everybody's really motivated, they're having a great day every single day, and the Scrum process is a really invigorating experience for everybody involved. It's something that's a daily process, so I do see it as more of an ongoing battle than actually something you can conquer. It's not only me who loves Scrum, it is the world that actually loves Scrum at the moment. This is from a version 1 survey, which surveyed 4,000 different companies to find out what sort of practices they were actually using. And these were obviously all using Agile practices. 58% of the people surveyed said they are using pure Scrum. But if you have a look at the people using some sort of Scrum hybrid or Scrum ban, it's actually 75% of the people who are actually using some form of Scrum. I know the very last talk at the end of this conference by Dave West from the Scrum Alliance, he's going to be talking a little bit about some of this stuff as well. And in their numbers, they actually claim that there's 90% of Agile teams are using the Scrum process. So whichever numbers you actually look at, it is pretty much the predominant framework that people put in place when it comes to working with Agile. And just looking at the amount of people who stood up in this room when I asked that very first question, it was 99% of people who seemed to stand up. So it is a vastly popular framework. While it is a vastly popular framework, it can get a little bit monotonous if it's not tended to and looked after. This is an image from Groundhog Day. Hands up who's seen Groundhog Day? Does anybody know how many days Bill Murray actually experienced in Groundhog Day? Well, initially, this is completely outside of the bounds of my talk, but I just found this interesting. I was looking it up before I talked today. The initial estimate was, let's see, I'll have to read it out. It was 8 years, 8 months, and a number of days. But there's a great blog post where somebody goes into minute detail about everything that Bill Murray learned and every day that you see and that he's mentioned. And they figured that he actually goes through 34 years in the movie Groundhog Day. So there's an interesting fact for you if somebody ever asks you how many days Bill Murray experienced in Groundhog Day, which is a pretty common question. So what is Scrum Fatigue? What do I mean by Scrum Fatigue? Like I said at the start of this talk, you do go through the same motions to get to different results at the end of every single sprint. You have your sprint planning, you have your daily stand-ups, you have your sprint review, you have your sprint retrospective, and those things can get monotonous over time if you're doing a sprint in and sprint out. And the longer a team's actually using the Scrum process, the more tired they're going to get with each of these ceremonies. I've seen teams who are new to Scrum and they get really passionate about it, they get really excited, it's so team focused, it's a wonderful thing to see and a wonderful thing to actually go through. But over time, a bit of ennui can actually set in with your teams, and that's precisely what I'm going to be talking about today. I am going to talk about some of the stuff that I've put in place to help combat Scrum fatigue. I will talk about motivating teams outside of the Scrum process and some of the stuff that we've done within the Scrum framework itself to actually make it a more invigorating process and framework for the teams. And I will actually be asking you guys as well, what have you done to make, for example, your stand-ups more memorable or more exciting? What have you done to make your sprint reviews more interesting and engaging? So why should we actually care about Scrum fatigue? I think some of the answers there are a little bit obvious. It is a wonderful framework. It gets amazing results if it's run really, really well. One thing that we'll be talking about today, and a lot of people who don't really work in the Agile way, I'm pretty sure you've encountered this yourself. They think there's not a lot of discipline in Agile. If there's not a lot of discipline in Agile, the framework does start to fall apart. So I will be addressing that today. If you don't have discipline in your Scrum process, not only will Scrum fatigue set in, but the results that you're actually going to get, well, you're not going to get the results you want. You're not going to get deliverables. You're not going to be getting your valuable software released at some sort of a predictable cadence. So it is something that if you are using Scrum, it's certainly something that you have to care about. You can't just take a step back and hope it's all going to work out. Every single day when you wake up, you have to think, what can I do to help make sure that not only is the Scrum framework happening as it should happen, but also that people are actually embedding the Agile values and principles in the Scrum framework. Without the Agile values and principles, Scrum is simply not going to work. Also, you want happy teams. You want happy teams because happiness does actually matter. The emphasis on happiness at the moment is pretty strong. I see a big push for people to make happy teams and help their company be a happy company. My quarterly goal in my own company is to make sure that our teams remain happy. Things are going pretty well at the moment, but it's something that does need to be maintained. Why do we want happy teams? Surely if it's a miserable team and they're still producing results, that's absolutely fine. The bottom line is still going to be met, but it's not happiness for the sake of happiness. A survey done in 2009 found that people who are happy at work and go into work with a positive outlook are 10% more productive than if they were just neutral. And if they're in fact unhappy at work, or if something terrible has happened before they come into the workplace, they are 12% less productive. So the impact is really, really huge in terms of what people actually produce at work. Another survey, I did read through a lot of surveys when I was preparing this talk, and don't worry, you don't have to listen to all the statistics I came up with. I just picked some of the best ones, but one of the most startling ones for me, and the one that really made my jaw hit the ground a little bit, was 13% of people surveyed are engaged in the work that they do. 13% of people are engaged in the work that they do, which is an insanely low number. And this is across industries. This is not just software, but still that really worried me because if you don't have engaged people, you're not going to have happy people. If you don't have happy people, you're not going to have a productive workplace, and you're going to have unmotivated staff members. There's a lot of debates that I have with people who do what I do at the moment. What comes first, happiness like happy teams or motivated teams, or is it motivated teams produce happiness? I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, really. So I will be using quite a few examples from a long-running Scrum team that I've been Scrum Master for from the outset when they started 8 years ago. And just finished being Scrum Master now. I wasn't Scrum Master for the full 8 years. I kind of dipped in and out. But I think you can imagine after 8 years, fatigue is going to set in. And when I'm talking about the team, I'm not just talking about the product owners, I'm not just talking about the developers and the testers and the designers, people who are actually doing the work. I'm also talking about the product owners and the Scrum Masters, because fatigue can certainly set in for those guys as well. So this is very familiar to all of you, the Scrum process. In 8 years, if you're doing 2-week sprints, you will have 204 sprint plannings, 204 potentially shippable increments, 204 sprint reviews and retrospectives, and perhaps most startlingly, 1,836 daily stand-ups. And I think you can imagine by about 1,831, people might be getting a little bit sick of the stand-up process. So it's something that needs to be changed, and real care needs to be taken with each of the ceremonies within the Scrum process. Just very quickly, some of the work that this team actually does. It's the Digital New Zealand project, which includes Papers Past, fantastic site if you want to go to. It's got 30 million records, newspapers, articles dating back to 1839 from New Zealand. It's a fantastic resource. Services to schools and the National Library website as well. So this is something that they've been working on for 8 years. Very lucky to have those guys as a client because they are very committed to the Agile way of working. And they don't believe that you just build a website or a piece of software and send it off and just let it go into the world. They understand that you have to keep working on something, enhancing it, and making it better based on the feedback you get from your end users. So what are some of the smells that you might get from a team who is starting to experience Scrum fatigue? First of all, you will notice that people are becoming a little bit disengaged in their meetings. If people aren't finishing everything that they predicted they might finish in the upcoming sprint, they probably won't even really care that much because that stuff is just going to roll over like it always rolls over. You're going to get a really good sense of ennui coming from your teams. Also, there's no real conversations happening with the team. They go into sprint planning, just go through the motions and say, thank God we got through that, but there's not really an invigorating conversation, and there's not many unknowns coming to the surface. There's no healthy conflict happening. People are literally just going through the motions. Those are the smells. Some of the symptoms that you might actually see when teams are suffering from Scrum fatigue. Scrum fatigue, you will have unproductive ceremonies. My least favorite meeting to attend is a meeting that has nothing at the end of it, where the agenda isn't met, where the outcomes haven't been met at the end. That is a waste of everybody's time, and the more people you have in that meeting, the more expensive that waste of time becomes. So unproductive ceremonies. Lack of clarity around backlog items. If you're not having those essential conversations around what goes into the backlog, what the intentions of each story are, things are going to be shambles once you get to the actual sprint itself. Regularly not achieving your deliverable increments. Teams not really holding themselves accountable. Team members just picking up stories and working in silos. I have seen teams when they finish a sprint and it comes to the review, the team are amazed at what that person has achieved within the sprint. That's not a really good sign. They should know exactly what they've been doing throughout the sprint. Scrum deteriorating to the point of being a series of mini waterfalls. I'm sure some people have seen that in their own day-to-day work. People are doing all the design at the start of the sprint, doing all the development in the middle of the sprint, and doing all the testing at the end of the sprint when it's too late to rectify anything. And this is insanely common. Like I said, Dave West, the CEO of Scrum Alliance, is doing a talk at the very end of this conference. I saw him do a talk earlier on in the States, and they did mention that part of the reason why Scrum isn't having the magnificent results we all hoped that it would have in the world of software is because people are just doing mini waterfalls, or else they're forcing Scrum into their already waterfall organization and not really making the changes they need to make to see the real benefits that you should be seeing. And finally, people start leaving. People are going to start leaving if they're getting bored, if it's a lackluster place to work, if Scrum is just becoming a chore, people will just leave, and you will miss some really good people, which is a damn shame. So I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that we put in place to help motivate the teams before I start to talk about the specifics of the Scrum framework itself. As part of a meetup for a while, it's the Management 3.0 meetup. Hands up, anybody who's come across Management 3.0? Few people. So it's a company started by Jürgen Appelow. Highly recommend his book. It's a pretty dense book, but it's well worth it if you can get your hands on it. I saw a talk from him earlier in the year as well called Managing for Happiness. And one of the tools that he mentioned was something called moving motivators. And it was something that I picked up when I worked at Silver Stripe as well. There's a few Silver Stripers here today. Moving motivators is where Jürgen talks about the intrinsic motivators of a team, not the extrinsic motivators. What I mean by extrinsic motivators are things like getting a promotion, getting a pay rise, things like that. Intrinsic motivators are the things that actually motivate people on an internal level, and he has defined 10 intrinsic motivators and represented these on very nice, colorful, cartoony cards. This is free to download off the Management 3.0 website if you're interested in it at all. So what I did when I decided to bring this into how we worked at Boost, went and talked to every single developer, every single designer, laid out the 10 cards for them and talked to them about extrinsic and intrinsic motivators and got them to prioritize these cards. On the left-hand side would be what they consider to be the least important motivating factor for them until they got to the right-hand side of that horizontal line, and that would be the most motivating factor for them. Those would be the instructions, at least. Most people would do it right to left, but you can't get everything the way you want it. Fascinating process because you learn a lot about a person. They talk about each of these motivators, why it motivates them. Developers aren't known to be the most verbose people at times, so you can extract a lot of information. It really helps you to get to know the people that you're actually talking to. Then I asked them to raise up the cards if they thought that Boost was allowing these motivating factors to thrive for them, and push the card down if we're actually blocking any of these. So then we could get information around what we had to work on. We compiled all the results. We made them visible. Actually, I'll put that up. That's where we made them visible on the wall. Everybody's top 3 motivating factors. Compiled all that stuff and came up with the top 3 motivating factors for everybody at Boost. Top 1 was mastery, and that is you are pushing yourself when you come into work, but you're not working outside of your actual capabilities. Next one was power. That is, I have enough freedom to actually influence what happens around me in my organization. And the third one was relatedness. That was, I have good social contacts with the people that I actually work with. Put it up on a board. We have a lot of visual workspaces all around the office. I'm a big fan of Post-its and whiteboards, as I'm sure many people here are. And we get people to stick up little Post-its around things that they would like to put in place in our organization that would help boost their chances to master their craft, or give them access to more decision making at Boost, or help them to just celebrate things a little bit more and spend more time together as a team. And unless it's a crazy idea, of course, some ideas are crazy, we move them across to the right-hand side. So far, the ideas have been all very, very doable and really sensible ideas. I'm still waiting for something that's completely bonkers and having that awkward conversation. Some of the stuff that came out of that, the first one, like I said, was mastery. One example was we have an R&D day now every single fortnight. And that has really, really helped to break up the occasional relentlessness of the Scrum process. It does have a considerable financial impact for us as a company, but we have found the benefits have so far outweighed the financial negatives of letting everybody just do unbillable work basically every fortnight. Some of the stuff that comes out of the R&D day has been pretty spectacular to see. Some of it we've been able to incorporate into clients' projects, and some of it is just really cool and stuff that we've been considering turn into our own products. It's a very, very productive day. We encourage people to work with people they don't usually work with during R&D day. The picture you see there is when people are shouting out what they actually want to work on. We're getting better and better at this. I would say when we first started doing R&D, it was a little bit unstructured. As we go through it more and more, We help the developers to define a little bit more structure and define how they're going to work together. Otherwise, things do get a little bit out of control. At the end of the day, we have presentations now, for example, in one room. We have rounds of applause, and and we have clients attend those presentations. It's a hugely successful thing to do every fortnight, and that came directly from the moving motivators and the ideas that we got from the developers. Some of the other stuff that came out of the moving motivators in terms of mastery, we now get people to host their own lunch and learns. The developers do that themselves, and we've got a couple of technical mentors who come in. One comes in weekly, one comes in monthly to work with the team, because we do have quite a young team, and they felt there was a real lack of senior development or mentorship at Boost. The second one was power. That, just to remind you, there's enough room for me to influence what happens around me. One of the things that came out of that was that we do have retrospectives at the end of each sprint cycle, but that is very much focused on the team in question. Now, every fortnight, we have a retrospective that covers all the teams. It's everybody in one room talking about how things are going to boost. It's a really open, honest conversation. Sometimes I'm usually the person facilitating it. Sometimes hard to hear because it is brutally honest because there's no clients around, but that's exactly why we want it to be like, because you get such useful information out of it. And from the developer retros, again, we've gotten really, really great results. One point of interest, there was a lot of goals that came out of the developer retros. We've whittled those down to one really actionable goal per retrospective. And the person who owns that goal isn't going to be me or anyone else on the leadership team. The developers have to own their own goals. They have to make sure that they happen with the ideas they come up with here. They have to make sure that they get actioned. And the third one was relatedness. That was a pretty easy one, and lots of ideas for that. We just started doing lots of fun stuff like Escape Mate. In Wellington, you can get locked into a bank vault, and they leave clues around it. You have to escape out of the bank vault as a team. Went to Asiana cooking school. We're having a picnic in the zoo. Just lots of things. There's a pretty multicultural bunch of people at Boost. And a lot of people don't, for example, drink. So you can't just say, let's go out drinking together. You have to do something that's all inclusive for everybody. And to celebrate things more often. During the Scrum process, you do work to a deadline, I guess, every single sprint, but you don't always celebrate some of the things that happen mid-sprint or the things that happen for the teams within the Scrum framework. So now we do celebrate. We get cakes, we get food, and it doesn't really matter what sort of food it is. Whatever you do, it's just an excuse to get everybody in the same area celebrating something that a team has done. And these are specific things that we are celebrating. They're not vague things like, well done for working hard this week. They are very specific things that we are celebrating. And finally, that wouldn't be worth that much unless we actually measured how we're tracking. So we do send out a survey to see how we're tracking against each of those three motivating factors. The reason it stops in October there is because we have now redone the moving motivators exercise with the entire organization because we had some new people and just wanted to see how things have changed. So those top three motivating factors have actually changed. Now we still have mastery at the top, and the next two are curiosity and honor. So those are brand new things up on the board, and we're getting brand new ideas as well. And we'll restart this. Very quickly, the bottom three factors are kind of interesting as well. None of these things are not important, but some are less important than others. People decided they didn't really care about order. They didn't care about having enough rules and policies for a stable environment, so we haven't spent too much time on that. We have made sure that we have just enough policies in place to make sure people feel comfortable in their role. We have a good onboarding process now, a good hiring process now, just enough to make people feel secure in their role. Status, people didn't really care too much about status. We don't have any role titles. We just have developer or designer or scrum master. But we do make sure that we look after people's professional development, and we put people on leadership courses if they feel they want to go on leadership courses and things like that. Again, we don't spend too much time on that stuff because it ended up where it ended up. And finally, freedom. I am independent of others with my own work and responsibilities. We are a very team-focused company, but we do make sure that people are free to work on their own projects if they want to, and that is confined within R&D day. And like I said, we do give them space to do that work as well. So one thing that didn't come out of any of that process was the actual purpose. Nobody really spoke about the purpose. You're working on something for 8 years. It's very easy to lose sight of what you're actually doing and why you're doing it. It's a long, long period of time. You can just think, oh my God, we're just shipping another thing out to the National Library or Digital NZ. So I could see that people had lost sight of not only why they're doing what they're doing, but who they're doing it for. So we organized a tour around the library. This picture here, we're going behind the scenes, looking at some of the conservation work that they do behind the scenes in the National Library. This is pretty cool. This guy that's an actual notebook from Catherine Mansfield, and he's removing mud from that book. Interestingly, everything you do to these items has to be reversible in case new technology comes along. They'll help you actually conserve things better. The guy in the background is working on old album covers and restoring those. As a vinyl collector, that was of great interest to me. We got a tour around the library. All the management team did a big presentation to us. They told us where they've come from, why they exist, who their audiences are, and where they're going in the future, and how we can be part of where they're going in the future as well. I was hoping that everybody would come back to the office filled with purpose and say, yes, we really love what we do, and we have total understanding of why we're doing what we're doing now, but it actually took a long time to get that information ingrained in the team. And none of that would be any use at all unless you had the right people. This is a pretty interesting one. A lot of people, when I did this talk a while back, and a lot of people asked me about performance management. I didn't quite understand how it was related, but a lot of people asked me about performance management. Anyway, and what you do with people who just aren't working well within the team. And the thing is, with any agile process, you need people to buy into the way that you work, and you need people to work well as teams, and getting those right people is absolutely essential, and that's part of what we do in our hiring process now. In terms of performance management, we don't do any of that stuff. We coach people as much as we possibly can. If they prove to be uncoachable, at that point, they're probably better off working somewhere else. We absolutely believe that you need the right people, and that's the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the team members to make it work. So the Scrum Guide. Show of hands, who's read the Scrum Guide? It's only, I think, 17 pages long, and pretty much tells you everything you need to know about actually implementing Scrum and the framework itself. But until recently, it didn't mention any of this stuff. I think it was June or July they put this stuff into the Scrum Guide, and it's more about the mindset that goes behind working on Scrum projects. It's fantastic to actually see it go into the Scrum Guide now. It's only half a page, but still, I think it's a step in the right direction, and that's working with courage, not being afraid to speak your mind or make courageous decisions, focus, that you are focusing on building the right thing at the right time, commitment to the work that you're doing, also your team members, respect for your team members, and absolute openness when it comes to discussing the product or the team and how you can work better together. So it's great to see this stuff actually in the Scrum Guide now. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about being agile over doing agile. You can pick up Scrum and have no idea about the values and principles, and things are just not going to work. So it's great to see some mindset stuff coming into that very short Scrum Guide. Interesting slide up next. I assume most people here were at Jeff Patton's talk this morning. He showed a slide from the Standish Chaos Report 2015 and said, never reference this report. So we're going to reference that report next, which is fantastic. He did mention that it was very, very old, and there was only 4 companies that were interviewed. This is actually a year old, and there's 50,000 projects that were taken into account when building this report. So I do think it's valid. People often look at Scrum and say, why do Scrum projects fail? And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about, or what I am talking about. So certainly the project failure rates of waterfall versus agile. Agile is doing better. So large projects, 42% of failure for the waterfall projects, 23% for agile. But still, it feels like an awful lot. And if you look at a little bit of a breakdown around that, Agile is successful 39% of the time, and when they say successful, they mean things which are on budget, on time, and on target. Well, that's what they used to mean. They've expanded that out because any project can be on time, on budget, and on target, and still not create any actual value for the user at all. So now they've incorporated the value that it's actually giving and the benefits that it's giving to the end users as well. But still, 39% successful, 52% challenged, 9% failed isn't It's fantastic. It's certainly not the silver bullet that we might have hoped for 20 years ago when Scrum first came into the software development world. The reasons for that are probably many. From my own experience and from talking to people like Dave West, a lot of people are just ditching the hard stuff. They're getting rid of retrospectives because they feel they're a bit too touchy-feely. They don't do reviews because they haven't finished anything that sprint. Sprint planning is just, yeah, let's do this, or even worse, people are telling them what to do in those sprint plannings. So Scrum takes real work and real attention, and it's a difficult thing to do. And without any of those elements, it's fine, you can experiment with how you run your retrospectives, how you run your sprint plannings, but make sure that you do your sprint plannings and your retrospectives and make sure that you get the results out of those that you should do. It's very easy to throw that stuff away because it's a little bit too hard. A lot of you, I'm sure, have heard people say, we're doing Agile now, we do stand-ups every morning. It's great. I'm sure that's increasing the transparency and visibility of our project to stakeholders and the rest of the team members. But still, that's certainly not Scrum, and it's certainly not working in an Agile way. Where's the principles? Where's the values? I've also spoken to a lot of teams who find Scrum very, very difficult because they realize there's lots of impediments in how they actually work, which I think is fantastic. Scrum is very good at shining a light on some of the inefficiencies in organizations. And if you don't shine a light on those inefficiencies, you can't possibly do anything to try to rectify them. So the earlier you find those problems, the easier you can actually attend to them. Sometimes people move to Kanban because it seems like it's a little bit easier to do, it's a little bit more lightweight. To see somebody shaking their head. Why were you shaking your head, just out of curiosity? Yep. Similar problems. And Kanban is actually, I think, harder because it is less structured, so it's harder to put in place. And for people who are new to working in Agile, I think Scrum is fantastic. It's like a set of training wheels. It almost forces you to embed a lot of those values and principles. And Kanban is almost I don't know, possibly for the experts. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about elements of the Scrum process that we have changed and some ideas that we've put into different little elements within the Scrum framework itself to try and make sure that they're exciting and we're still getting the great benefits that we should be from them. First of all, our board. This is our old board. This was in place for a long, long time. There's no tasks on it or anything because I took the photograph after we stopped using it. So we have all the stories in the left-hand columns. This is split into sort of two columns. Stories down the left, tasks will start in the not started column and move across to done like most Scrum boards. I did notice that the team were just referencing this at the stand-ups, not really engaged in it, and I started to realize that is this board just for me at this stage? And I asked the question to the team. They said, yeah, we update the board every day because you want the board updated, which made me feel embarrassed, to be honest. So I said, well, let's change the board now, today. Let's just take a step back and change it. So this is the board that we use today. Actually, it's changed a lot since then. This is probably a couple of months old, this particular photograph. It's more of a Kanban-style board. Much more closely follows the process that our teams actually go through. It's done in whiteboard marker so we can change it whenever we need to change it. And now they interact with it all throughout the day. I can have a glance and see where things are. Product owners can see if there's blocks that they need to help to remove. And the teams can see where there's blocks where they need to improve things. And now they have work in progress limits over things that are actually in development. You might notice this guy's face on a lot of the post-its. It's not just because he's a massively productive worker. He's just an ex-employee of Boost. We had leftover magnets, and by the time the stickies get to the right-hand side, they lose a lot of their stickiness, so we use him to keep those post-its on the board. And that's just a small change. It's just the board, but it's a huge change as well because people they're interacting with it throughout the whole day. It's a conversation starter. And if you're not having conversations around your boards or around your ceremonies, things aren't working. So sometimes the small, relatively simple change, this took, I don't know, an hour probably to put together. It had a huge impact over how the team have worked. And now they have added little bits and pieces, taken away bits and pieces. It's constantly evolving. So I'm going to go through each of the ceremonies of the Scrum process and just tell you a couple of things that we've tried. And if anybody has any ideas, I'd be interested for you to shout those out as well, because I'm sure everybody here has lots of different ideas. None of them are right. None of them are wrong. The most important thing is that you're actually experimenting and trying out some ideas. If they don't work, fine. If they do work, fantastic. Keep using them until they get stale and then move on to something else. So backlog refining meeting. One thing I've noticed teams doing a lot in backlog refining meetings, and I'm sure you guys have seen it as well, is they sit around a computer and they update the backlog in Jira or Rally or whatever it is you're actually using. There's a term, I'm pretty sure it's not in the dictionary yet, Jirandicitis, and that's the disease of just doing everything in Jira and not moving outside of Jira. And the backlog refining meetings can turn into just an updating your tool meeting. And I saw that happening, so I just printed everything out and got people to get really physical with the actual stories themselves. If they needed to add stuff to the stories, they wrote it down on Post-its, stuck it to the story. If they wanted to size the stories, even the use of poker planning cards is getting a bit stale with those guys, so they just sized up the stories very manually. They put the smaller stories down the bottom of a table, the bigger stories at the top of the table. We just mixed it up, so it was a very physical exercise and made sure that people were actually talking about what they were doing. They were getting up, they were moving stuff around, and it was a much more collaborative experience. At the end of that, yes, sure enough, all that information did have to go into a tool, but the process of getting to that point was a much more fun experience for everybody else. Anybody else got anything they've tried in refining meetings that's zhuzhed them up a little bit? No, it's a tough one too. It's not the most scintillating meeting in the first place. Backlog refining, even the name of it has changed from grooming. It's hard to make it into a fun meeting. So the most valuable thing we did was to make everything as physical as we possibly could to get people actually moving around. Sprint planning, again, we made sure that we made everything physical. People are just moving cards around, adding Post-its to their stories. One thing I did notice was team members were getting pretty bored with the tasking process itself, and the tasks were becoming redundant, I would say. People weren't discussing what they were writing down on the Post-its. Nobody knew what anybody else was actually adding to those stories. So we elected one person to become the writer of the tasks. So everybody would talk about what they want to do, and the person who's writing the task would dictate. They'd listen for the points, the important points, and say, okay, I think that's a task, okay, stick to the story. Then listen to the conversation a little bit more, also taking part and write down the task. That meant that everybody was actually talking about how they're going to approach the story together and still capturing those all-important tasks. But it did ensure that people just weren't off in a corner writing their own tasks. You get anything, anybody's tried sprint planning sessions that's made them a little bit more interesting than they can be? Yep, over here.
We get our team to self-select to share group tasks. So based on subject matter, if they want something to add to a particular story, they'll go on and work part of the story.
Nice. In case anybody didn't hear that, so you got the team to self-select around groups and task things up around particular subjects if that was their forte. Yep. Nice. So splitting up the tasks that you're actually writing and looking at the complexity of within those tasks. Nice. And what benefits did you get from doing that?
Stuff that I just found overwhelmingly complicated. We don't think we don't think it's they're complicated. They can explain why.
Well, that's such a hugely valid thing, right? So in case anybody didn't hear that stuff that you thought was complicated, as soon as you started sharing that with other people, the complexity got broken down, and as a group you made it less complex, or at least probably mentally less complex. And that's so important. Having those conversations and being able to get to a solution is so much easier when you have many different minds doing it, and so much more enjoyable as well. Daily stand-up. I find the daily stand-up pretty difficult at times. It can so easily devolve into just a status update. You go through the 3 questions. I was like, oh. So we just put it to developers. What do you want to do to make the stand-ups more fun? There's a lot of things like everybody claps as soon as stand-up is over. People throw balls to each other as it's their turn to talk. But the most interesting thing I saw them do, and I was very surprised that they chose to do it. They wanted to do it earlier. That surprised me, first of all, because usually they come in at pretty random times. And they wanted to do it rather than each team have their stand-up. They wanted to mix it up a little bit. So one week, Team A and Team B would do a stand-up together, and the next week Team C and Team D would do a stand-up together. That way they could see what everybody else is doing. And it was pretty fascinating to watch. I thought it would become a little bit laborious, but there's a lot of interest in what everybody else is doing, and it's promoting, again, a huge amount of conversation around everybody is doing, and sharing knowledge across the company. And I suppose we're lucky enough to be in the position that we can do that sort of thing. Again, any ideas about how to make your daily stand-ups more exciting down the back? Yep. Nice. And yeah, a long stand-up there's nothing worse. There's nothing worse than going, oh my God, I have to go to the stand-up. I have no idea how long it's actually going to be. And getting that the right level of information in that 15 minutes can be pretty tricky at times. Nice. Okay, sprint review. Sprint reviews, again, fascinating meeting. You can get really great results out of it. If you have people who haven't seen what's been built over the last couple of weeks, however long your sprint is, get them into the same room and watch developers demo with pride what they've worked on in the last sprint. It can be a really invigorating meeting and can have impacts on the future of what you're actually building. But on the flip side, they can just be, I did this, I did this, I did this. So some things we've tried, we do make sure that we get people into the room who haven't actually been present for the last sprint, because that changes things dramatically. They ask a lot of interesting questions, and to make sure that the developers are, well, they're aware that these people haven't seen it, so they talk through it as if the person has never seen it, because they haven't. If they're aware that everybody in the room has already been very involved on a daily basis, they'll just rush through it pretty quickly. And we make sure that we celebrate the achievements of a team. Every single time you come to the end of a sprint, it's time for a celebration. We bring food. Food is a great exciter, and it's a great bringer together of people. If you put some treats in the middle of a table, that's almost instantly going to be a better meeting than if there aren't treats in the middle of the table. Food is like the easiest solution to so many problems in the world, including starvation, I hear. It's good for that. And one thing we started doing is doing our sprint reviews outside. We did have the idea to do this very, very recently. Then we had a day of rain and a day of earthquakes that you may have experienced. So now that it's starting to be a little bit sunnier outside, we're going to do our reviews outside. We'll have visitors. We're lucky enough to have a park directly beside our building, and we'll do our reviews outside. It's going to be much more relaxed. Hopefully, it's going to be a much more relaxed meeting and promote a lot of conversation that may not happen if we're just in the same office that we've always been in. Again, anybody got any great sprint review ideas? Marcello? Nice. So, and I can hear only about 50% of what you're saying. So that's again, that's about getting external people into those meetings. Yeah, nice. Yeah, because when it does get to the stage where you're just going tick, 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 you may as well not have that meeting. There's no value actually coming out of that sprint review. And finally, going to talk about the sprint retrospective. This is probably the easiest meeting to keep invigorating because there's already so much literature out there as to how you can run retrospectives, different activities that you can run. I'm a huge fan of Esther Darby's book, Agile Retrospectives. That was my Bible when I started being a Scrum Master. Retromat is a great site for retro activities and just making up your own stuff and being brave. They don't always work, but if they do work, it's fantastic. If they don't work, fine, just don't do that again. Do your sprint retrospectives in different places, mix them up. Sometimes people feel too much pressure to make every single retro different, but if you do 204 retros, they can't possibly all be different, or else some of them are going to be pretty barmy. But as much as you can, make sure that they're open, they're honest, you're mixing it up as much as you possibly can. Again, introduce food. And make sure, probably most importantly, that you come up with good actionable goals, a few good actionable goals at the end of your retrospective, and make sure that they actually do get actioned. Recently we held a retro, just as a check-in exercise. We put up all the retro goals we came up with in the last few months on a board and got the team to move them across to actioned or not actioned. Just to see how many we have actually put in place, and as they moved them across the board, we had a discussion around, did it actually have a positive impact? It was a fascinating exercise to go through. So last time I'll ask the audience, any particularly good or exciting retro things that you did to make them engaging? Nice. So again, because you're down the back, so I think you're talking about other teams coming in and they have no context, so it's going to be a particularly, well, I like the idea of them having no context because everything's going to be a bit of a surprise for them. And also around that no context thing, inviting different people to actually come in and run those retrospectives, not necessarily the Scrum Master or a team member, somebody who has no context around what the team has actually been doing, and running that retrospective can be a lot of fun. Like I've mentioned a few times, all of the stuff that you do in the Scrum framework is there to promote conversation, good, healthy conversation. If that conversation is not happening, it needs to be looked at. Just a few things. This is all well and good, but some stuff that I've done in the past to try and measure this. This image here is from my time working at Silver Stripe. We had a team called the Rebasers. We put up a Pineco Nikka calendar, and every single day, at the end of the day, the developers would leave and put a face up under their corresponding day. Down the left, it's all their different avatars. So if they're feeling happy, they put a smiley face. If they're feeling neutral, just a line. If they're feeling sad, a sad face. Or if they're on holiday, like the second from bottom there, pictures of him scuba diving and swimming with dolphins and playing and drinking cocktails. This became a really fun exercise, and we did track this over time. It was a really good signifier of when the team wasn't feeling happy, which we could see if we noted down what was happening on that particular day. You could see the impact that it was actually having on the product. We were able to bring this to the client so the client could understand how important it was that we weren't over-pressuring the team. We used this for a short while. It's the Happiness, Innovation, Productivity Survey by David Mole at TradeMe. Basically asks some questions around the intrinsic motivators. We did find that there was just too many questions, so we weren't getting a great response, so we had to look around for something else and found Tiny Pulse, which I'm really enjoying at the moment. Every fortnight, actually, it's every month now. We ask a question to the team. It's an automated email, goes out to the team on a scale of 1 to 10. How happy are you at work? One of my goals is to make sure our happiness level doesn't drop, which is difficult at times. But it's a very simple question to answer. You just have to click a button. It's answered, so you get that really good information really, really quickly, and you can track that over time. And apart from that question, every single week they get other slightly more difficult questions they have to think about. So do you feel comfortable providing upward feedback to your supervisor? People can leave comments too. It's all anonymous. If you were to give notice and leave our organization, what would be the primary reason? Again, great information to get, and because it's anonymous, people can be really, really honest with these answers. And we've been tracking that over time. Here's some of our results. So the industry benchmark, so people in the software industry, the happiness level benchmark is 7.3. Worldwide, outside software and every other industry, it's 7.5. We're currently at 8.2, which I'm really happy about. But obviously, something terrible could happen next week, and that might come back down. But it is my job to keep those numbers up. And it's our response rates are getting a lot better now because the questions are so straightforward. So we've got 16 out of 20 responses there, which is a pretty good gauge of how the teams are getting on. And the last thing that we do, we make sure that we do have one-on-ones with every single person in the company every fortnight. We talk about how they're getting on. We try to ask them questions that invoke their curiosity and make sure that their development goals are in place for them and that they're able to get closer to achieving those development goals. It's very easy to book meetings over your one-on-ones, but for us, we have realized that they are absolutely precious, these meetings. Don't not do the one-on-ones. It's very easy for life to get in the way, but make sure that they actually do happen. So what happens after Scrum Fatigue? When Scrum Fatigue is absolutely gone, like I said at the start, there is no after. It's a constant thing. Every day when you wake up, every day when I wake up, I think of something that I can do to help motivate our team and keep the Scrum process and framework an interesting framework for people to work in. And make sure not only is it interesting, because it's all for nothing if you're not delivering valuable software for your clients and creating delight for the people who are actually using your software. It is a constant daily thing. People ask me what happens if you suffer from fatigue. That's a very valid question. I myself have a coach who helps me with some of that stuff to make sure that none of my moods ever translate to the team. So we're just about out of time. There will be a few minutes for questions, I believe. So I have 3 simple takeaways if you want to take anything away from today's talk. Thank you very much for coming, by the way. So please do embrace, if you're going to do Scrum, embrace it. Make sure that you're getting the real benefits that you can do from each of the artifacts, each of the ceremonies. Put as much effort into it as you can. Experiment, play around with it. Measure, otherwise you're not going to know if those experiments are actually failing or being successful. So embrace, experiment, and measure your Scrum framework. Thanks, everybody.